Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book, The Screwtape Letters from My Atheist Perspective. In this video, we're going to be covering chapters 25 through 28 of the book. This is our second to last video in this series. We're almost done going through the Screwtape Letters. Can you believe it? So let's get started with chapter 25. Now, the problem with the people Wormwood's patient has been hanging around since falling in love with his new girlfriend, Screwtape says, is that they are merely Christian. Merely Christian. That has a familiar ring to it. I wonder, does this mean that Screwtape has been reading C.S. Lewis? Do C.S. Lewis's books exist in the universe in which the Screwtape Letters takes place? Fascinating questions. Anyway, merely Christian is the problem with these folks, and much better would be for them to practice what Screwtape calls Christianity and, which, as he describes it, substitutes for the faith itself some fashion with a Christian coloring. It's bad for their purposes as demons if they're just plain old Christians, if Christianity is in its essence what they're really interested in, if they can manage to move them onto something else. Some flavor of Christianity, some fashion having to do with Christianity, much better for their purposes. Screwtape writes of how they, meaning the denizens of hell, the demons, the bad guys, Satan's crew, how they have cultivated in humanity a fear of the same old thing. Since earthly life is experienced sequentially, humans must experience change. The enemy, or God, has made change a pleasurable thing for humans, but he doesn't want them to think of change as an end to itself. So in addition to a love of change, God gave humanity a love of permanence, intending for there to be a balance between the two. And this intended balance is represented in the seasons. The seasons change, differing from each other, but they change on a regular cycle, giving the changes a sense of permanence. Quote, "Now, just as we pick out and exaggerate the pleasure of eating to produce gluttony, so we pick out this natural pleasantness of change and twist it into a demand for absolute novelty. This demand is entirely our workmanship. This demand is valuable in various ways. In the first place, it diminishes pleasure while increasing desire, and continued novelty costs money, so that the desire for it spells avarice and unhappiness, or both. Finally, the desire for novelty is indispensable if we are to produce fashions or vogues." So you dig through all of the Christian ornamentation, and Lewis is basically preaching a form of moderation here. And as with much else in the book, it's good advice when you strip away all of the Christian ornamentation. Embrace change, but don't seek change for its own sake. Don't change things just to change them. And don't let a need for novelty stop you from appreciating what you have. Lewis wraps this up in a religious package, presenting it as the way God intends you to live, but there's no need to appeal to God here at all. Living a centered, balanced life is good for your physical and mental health, whether you believe in God or not. As Mr. Miyagi said, better learn balance. Balance is key. Balance good, karate good, everything good. Balance bad, better pack up, go home. Also, and I'm probably being a little pedantic here, but whatever, it's my show. I noticed that Lewis cites the changing of the seasons as an example of how things can be ever-changing but also stable. And it works well as an analogy to explain how change and permanence can coexist in a balanced way. And I suspect that's really the point, just to be illustrative. But the changing of the seasons is only regular for the time being. It isn't permanent. Seasons change on Earth because of Earth revolving around the sun and because of the degree to which the planet's axis is tilted relative to the sun as it revolves. There was a time when Earth's seasons were not what they currently are, to say the least. There was a time when there was no Earth, when there was no sun. And of course, there will come a time in the future when they will no longer be what they currently are. The present state of affairs in terms of the Earth and its changing seasons will not always be this way. And in fact, it is not always the way it is on every part of the planet. The seasons, as they change from point to point in the year for C.S. Lewis in England is very different from people living in different regions of the planet. So this idea of permanence and stable changeability, sort of regular changes, is really an illusion. The permanence of the changing of the seasons is an illusion, made possible by the fact that our species doesn't live very long. So from our perspective, things have always been this way and they will continue to be this way forever. But that's not the truth. The circumstances which Lewis, through Screwtape, credits to God's design are actually the result of a particular confluence of factors: Earth's axial tilt, Earth's distance from the sun, various characteristics of Earth's atmosphere and climate, the particular location on Earth from which you happen to be experiencing the seasons. All of these factors exist as a result of natural forces, not supernatural will, and they will not last forever. Anyway, back to the usefulness of fashions to Screwtape and company. Fashions are used to distract people from real dangers. The trick is to get people to become outraged at the least threatening vices and become appreciative of, as Screwtape puts it, the virtue nearest to that vice which we are trying to make endemic. As Screwtape puts it, cruel ages are put on their guard against sentimentality, feckless and idle ones against respectability, lecherous ones against puritanism, and whenever all men are really hastening to be slaves or tyrants, we make liberalism the prime boogie. Christ, that is uncomfortably prescient, isn't it? But Screwtape says the greatest triumph of all is to convince people to regard horror of the same old thing as a philosophy. God wants people to ask if a proposed course of action is righteous or prudent or possible. But hell, on the other hand, wants people to ask if it's in accordance with the general movement of the time. Is it progressive? Is it reactionary? Is it in line with the way history is going? These are the questions that Screwtape's gang wants people to ask. Get them to ask irrelevant, unanswerable questions, Screwtape says, while they ignore the simple, relevant ones. And while they're distracted with all that, he says, we have the better chance to slip in and bend them to the action we have decided on. You know, one of the most common techniques used by not just apologists and not just Christians, but religious teachers of many kinds and many faiths, is to paint a given activity or attitude or area of interest as of the devil, or as something that makes you vulnerable to the dark side, whatever the dark side happens to be from the perspective of that teacher. And here, Lewis frames fascination with fashion as such a thing. People get involved with fashions, with fads, with ideas and philosophies and theories that are trendy, and they forget what's really important. They overlook the fundamentals. They overlook the principles that transcend trendiness or what's fashionable. Again, this isn't necessarily a terrible point when divorced from its religious context. Becoming so preoccupied with trendy ideas that we lose sight of our values is something to be careful of. That can happen. But I don't care for Lewis's painting of everything frivolous as of the devil. Yes, fads and trendy things can pollute the discourse. They can distract us from more important things. But having a few frivolous interests isn't necessarily a bad thing. Not everything can be work. Not everything can be of deep philosophical or political or religious import. It's good to have something frivolous, something shallow, something silly that we can invest in, that we can turn to when we need a break from heavier things. I don't think it's healthy for society if too many people devote too much of their lives to frivolous things, but that doesn't mean that they should quite literally be demonized, as Lewis does here. As Mr. Miyagi also said, you remember lesson about balance? Lesson not just karate only, lesson for whole life. Whole life, have a balance, everything be better. I mean, Mr. Miyagi was an imaginary person. I would still prefer him over C.S. Lewis. My relative enjoyment of this book notwithstanding. So, that's chapter 25. Let's do chapter 26. Screwtape recommends that Wormwood use the period of courtship between the patient and his girlfriend to sow those seeds which will grow up 10 years later into domestic hatred. Screwtape launches into a lesson on the difference between charity and unselfishness. And the latter of those two, unselfishness, is a word invented by hell's philological arm. And it's meant to serve as a negative substitute for charity. And charity, of course, is the invention of God, of the enemy. The crucial distinction between the two is that unselfishness is focused on the self, not on others. Charity is about other people. Unselfishness reflects back on you. A charitable person will be glad to see others happy. An unselfish person will be primarily conscious of how their actions reflect on them. There's also a difference in how unselfishness is viewed between men and women that can be manipulated by Wormwood to his advantage. A woman, says Screwtape, acts unselfishly by taking trouble for others, while a man acts unselfishly by not giving trouble to others. The result is that women are much more given to making nuisances of themselves. But the real benefit is that men and women end up regarding the other as being selfish while thinking of themselves as unselfish. It's diabolical. They both reckon their unselfishness in different ways, and they wind up each thinking of the other as being the selfish ones while they think that they are acting in a most admirable, unselfish way. And the key to sowing long-term strife is to condition them to expect each other to be charitable and self-sacrificing, or unselfish and self-sacrificing, so that when the initial excitement of their relationship fades, the expectation will remain and they will each come to view it as an obligation. They will be unselfish toward the other party in the marriage, not because they love them and they want to make them happy, but because they feel that it's expected of them. It will start to weigh down on them. One will acquiesce to the other out of a sense of duty. What each person really wants will become more and more difficult to find out, and eventually they will both feel self-righteous while neither of them will be satisfied with the other. I have to say, this is all very simplified and based on generalities and stereotypes, but if we just give all of that to Lewis and assume that his assumptions are reasonably accurate, this is a diabolical plan, which I guess is appropriate, considering whose plan it is. And once you've got to that point, once you've got them to that point of sort of they mutually regard each other as being selfish and they're unsatisfied, but they feel as though they're expected to be charitable to the other person. Once you've got them in that place, there's something else you can try. It's called the generous conflict illusion. Quote, something quite trivial, like having tea in the garden, is proposed. One member takes care to make it quite clear, though not in so many words, that he would rather not, but is of course prepared to do so out of unselfishness. The others instantly withdraw their proposal, ostensibly through their unselfishness, but really because they don't want to be used as a sort of lay figure on which the first speaker practices petty altruisms. But he is not going to be done out of his debauch of unselfishness either. He insists on doing what the others want. They insist on doing what he wants. Passions are roused. Soon someone is saying, very well then, I won't have any tea at all, and a real quarrel ensues with bitter resentment on both sides. You see how it is done. Well, I've been in situations like this, and they are extremely frustrating. And Lewis really captures the way in which situations like this can build and almost become self-perpetuating. You say what you think someone else wants you to say. They say what they think you want them to say. You become so caught up trying to read the other person's mind, guess what they want, predict what they'll do in response to you, and it ends up that nobody gets what they want. And of course, your concern for the other person isn't genuine. You're just worried about making yourself look good, or keeping the peace, or some other ultimately self-serving motive. It's definitely a good thing to be able to anticipate the wants and needs of someone else. In a close relationship like a marriage, it's almost essential. You do and say things based on what you expect the reaction of the other person to be, and hopefully you can predict what the other person will do more often than not because you've gotten to know them. But if all you do is try to guess what the other person wants, and you're never just open and honest about what you want, or in asking them what they want, or what you think or what they think, then you're not really communicating with each other. You're not really in a relationship at that point. You're just volleying with each other. Of course, Lewis is chalking this up to the work of the devil, but the truth is this is just human nature. We're all susceptible to situations like this. There's a tendency in religion to paint the positive aspects of human nature as of God and the negative aspects of human nature as of the devil, but it's all human nature. Human nature is complex and conflicted. We're generous and kind and curious, and we're selfish and cruel and close-minded. It's not God and it's not Satan. It's us. Well, that's chapter 26. Let's go now to chapter 27, and Screwtape is once again unhappy with Wormwood. He opens this letter by declaring, "You seem to be doing very little good at present." Wormwood has been using the patient's new love to distract him from God, but now this distraction has become one of the main subjects of the patient's prayers, which means Wormwood's efforts have failed. Distractions are of no use if the patient becomes aware of them as distractions. Distractions that are given over to God only bring him closer to God, which hurts their efforts. There is still some hope, however. His new love has given the patient a dream of attaining earthly happiness, a dream that has already begun to affect his prayers to see the present war come to an end, things like that. Petitionary prayers, asking God for specific things. The patient can possibly be made to doubt the validity of these kind of petitionary prayers. And that's good, because petitionary prayers are a kind of prayer that God specifically tells people to pray. He wants people to pray for specific things. Pray for your daily bread. Pray for the poor. Pray for the good fortune and the goodwill, the good things that you want others to have in specific terms. That's the kind of prayer that God tells you to pray. Screwtape recommends manipulating the patient's reactions to the results of his prayers, whatever they are. So if he doesn't get what he prays for, then he should be made to see that lack of an answer to his prayer as proof that petitionary prayers don't work. If he does get what he prays for, then he should be made to see any natural causes which led to it. So he will think that God actually had nothing to do with it, and it would have happened had he prayed for it or not. Next, Screwtape attempts to correct any confusion Wormwood might have about why the patient would be susceptible to such confusion by explaining the way time works for God as opposed to humans. As temporal beings, humans exist within time and consider it to be an ultimate reality. But God exists outside of time and sees all of creation, including all of time, every moment of time, as a single whole. This is how God is able to know what's going to happen in a person's future without everything being predestined. From God's perspective, terms like past and present and future are meaningless because he sees everything happening at once. God isn't making anyone do anything. He's seeing everyone do everything at every point in time. Lewis goes more in depth on this subject in Mere Christianity, but the summary he gives here via Screwtape of how time supposedly works for God is pretty good. It's a compelling way of looking at it, presenting God as outside of time and able to view the universe in its entirety, not just in physical terms, but in temporal terms. So he sees not just every square inch of reality, but every moment of it, all at once. Unfortunately for Lewis, I don't think that quite solves the problem of predestination. Because God, according to this theory, sees all of time happening at once, I agree that it's fair to say that from his perspective, he doesn't know the future. But it's not God's perspective that is ultimately of concern to someone grappling with predestination. It's the human perspective. Whether God experiences time the way we do or sees it all at once from the outside, whether he wrote the history of the universe out chronologically from the first moment to the last, or made all of time in the same creative flash in which he made all of space, it doesn't matter. If the entire history of the universe, including what we linear beings at this moment in time perceive as the future, exists right now for God, then our futures are predestined. Lewis's argument seems to be, but God doesn't know your future because God doesn't see your future. He just sees everything that ever happens all at once. Yes, but God created it all. He created everything, including time, every single moment of time. That thing that God is looking at, that creation that includes not only all of space, but all of time, that's His creation. So whether He considers my future to be His unbounded eternal present or not isn't the point. God made what is, from my perspective, the future. It already exists. It's there. Which means that I just haven't gotten to it yet. Which means that it's predestined. Which means the choices I will make that lead to that future have already been decided. In a sense, I have already made them. I just haven't gotten to that point in time yet. I haven't experienced the making of them yet. But they've already been made. Which means that what I experience as free will is only an illusion. I was always going to make the choices I made. I'm always going to make the choices I will make. I never actually had a choice. I was never actually going to do anything other than what I did. Like I said, it's an interesting concept, the idea that God sees all of the universe at once, including all of time, as one just tableau laid out before Him. That's an intriguing concept, but it doesn't invalidate predestination for me. And now, on to chapter 28. And once again, Screwtape is irritated with Wormwood, this time for filling his letters with rubbish about the war, which Screwtape has already complained about and told him not to do. He fills his letters with rubbish about the war while neglecting to tell Screwtape about the spiritual state of his patient. He said, if you're going to tell me things about the war, at least tell me how these things are affecting the state of mind of the patient, because that's all I want to hear about from you. Screwtape scolds Wormwood for gleefully reporting on the air raids that are about to strike the patient's town, while failing to realize that if the patient is killed during one of those raids at this point in his life, given his relationship to God at the present time, he will almost certainly be lost to them and be welcomed into heaven by God, the enemy. Screwtape cautions Wormwood not to allow his immediate enjoyment of human suffering to distract him from the main point of his work. And that's another funny bit. Look, kid, we all love war and misery, but don't end up having so much fun that you forget what your job is. Don't be infected by our own propaganda, Screwtape warns. Humans only fear death as the greatest threat and revere survival as the greatest good because the forces of hell have convinced them to do so. The fact is, if the patient dies now, they lose him. But if he survives the war, they have hope. Quote, the truth is that the enemy, having oddly destined these mere animals to live in his own eternal world, has guarded them pretty effectively from the danger of feeling at home anywhere else. That is why we must often wish long life to our patients. 70 years is not a day too much for the difficult task of unraveling their souls from heaven and building up a firm attachment to the earth. The true value of time to their hellish work is revealed by how little of it God allows to them. Most humans die in infancy. Many others die in their youths. They are only able to truly work with those humans who live what they think of as a normal life, which is, ironically enough, something only a small minority of humans ever get to live, the so-called normal life. Why does God allow even that small minority to live relatively long lives, rather than taking them to heaven before the likes of Screwtape and Wormwood can get to them? Well, apparently, according to Screwtape, God wants a few of the people in heaven to have had the experience of resisting temptation and sin for 60 or 70 years. And Screwtape closes the chapter by urging Wormwood to keep his patient as safe as possible. You know, despite the aforementioned funny bit at the beginning, this chapter overall leaves me with a bad taste in my mouth. Lewis has described and is defending a system where a short life and a quick death are good things, because people who die in their youth, even people who die in infancy are more likely to go to God than people who live a long, long time. Living a long life is a bad thing from this perspective because time is Satan's friend, and a nice long life only gives tempters like Screwtape and Wormwood more opportunities to coax you toward damnation. Lewis even establishes that the human desire to survive, the human aversion to death, is something that comes to us from the devil. This is a truly ugly, offensive notion. Children who die before they have a chance to grow up and experience life have actually been done a great favor. They don't have to live and endure temptation and risk eternal suffering and torment. They get to go straight to God because they died young. How lucky they are. All those efforts to decrease the number of deaths in childbirth, to improve health care for young children, to increase the human lifespan. Waste of time. Worse than a waste of time. It only gives the devil more opportunities to tempt people away from God. Better that people be allowed to die young. This mindset isn't unique to Lewis, of course. Religious folks often try to comfort each other in the aftermath of the tragic death of a young person by saying, well, they're really the lucky ones because they're with God now. And the implications of that are still kind of shocking, that it's better for someone to die young than to live a long, full life. But when it's said in grief or with the intent to ease someone's sadness, it is at least marginally more acceptable than what is being presented by Lewis here, because Lewis isn't trying to comfort a grieving parent after the death of a young child. Lewis wrote a book where he says that demons of hell hope people live long lives because the longer we live, the more of a chance they have to damn us. And when God does allow us to live a long life, well, that's probably because he wants to have a few people in heaven who have the experience of resisting temptation for several decades. Why? Why is that important? I have no idea, and I doubt Lewis did either. Well, that's it for chapter 28. In the next video, we will cover chapters 29 through 31, plus the conclusion, the epilogue, really, which was published years later. Screwtape Proposes a Toast. We'll cover all of that and wrap up our consideration of the Screwtape letters then. Can you believe it's that time already? We're almost through yet another Atheist Read series, the second to last Atheist Read series ever. This is the second to last video in the second to last Atheist Read series. Thank you all, as always, for watching. Please feel free to comment on this. Tell me what you thought about whatever I've had to say, if you agree, disagree, if you are an atheist or a Christian or some other version of believer or non-believer. Whatever you have to say in response to what I've had to say, I'm interested in hearing. Also, please consider, if you enjoy this work that I do, if you enjoy the Atheist Read series and my YouTube work in general, not only like and share the video and subscribe to the channel, but also consider helping me to make more videos like this by supporting the channel through Patreon. You can go to www.patreon.com/SteveShives to become a patron for as little as $1 a month. Really, really helps me out a lot. Thanks everybody, as always, for watching, and I'll see you next time to conclude the series.